Fantasy Fixers is set to take flight with the Atlanta Falcons and Arthur Smith's second season as head coach. The Falcons got off to a decent start at 4-4 before falling flat and finishing the season at 7-10. Despite the constant heckling that Smith got from the fantasy football community, what he was able to do by pulling off the number 3 PFF graded offense was borderline genius. The offensive DVOA improved from 28 to 13 thanks to Smith's recipe, which really leaned into a run-centric attack. And in the passing game, it was based more on efficiency than volume. The Falcons led the NFL in play-action passing at 44% of their attempts, and they were number 3 in shift and motion concepts at 70%. Obviously, at 7-10, there is still room for improvement here. This was the number 32 neutral first down pass rate team, so there's still a chance for Smith to add additional edges to the things that he's doing. We also have the number 30 DVOA defense. There's a lot of improvements that the Falcons need to make in that area. And then finally, the puzzling utilization of players like Kyle Pitts. Not getting them on the field enough is something that definitely drew the ire of the fantasy football community. The good news is the Falcons have a young, ascending team, and they have the means to continue to improve this offseason. We saw Drake London, their first-round pick last season, have a really nice rookie campaign. We also saw Tyler Algier, a mid-round running back, come through. There's a chance they've hit on a real gem there. And then we look at free agency. They've got the second most cap room in the NFL, and they have high first and second round draft picks. So let's talk about 3 ways that the Falcons can improve in 2023. Priority number 1 for the Falcons has to be upgrading their quarterback room this offseason. So we've got to turn our attention to Desmond Ridder, the team's 3rd-round pick last season. While ownership remains optimistic, the coaching staff is very non-committal. We only have a small sample on Ridder, but there is a reason that he was a 3rd-round pick last season in a league that's very willing to reach for quarterbacks in the draft. So I have 3 primary concerns with Desmond Ridder, and number 1 is his ability from a clean pocket. Is the number 1 statistic for quarterbacks. It's sticky year over year. He finished 52 out of 54 per PFF. Secondly, when they went to play action, which is really designed to help the young quarterback, he finished 38 out of 38, and that is a very important concept to use in the Arthur Smith offense. And lastly, many people think that Ridder is a dual threat quarterback, and the data just doesn't really support that. In fact, last season, when they switched from Marcus Mariota to Ridder, the design rushing attempts for the team dropped from 14% to 4%. So there are a few different avenues that the Falcons can think about here. First, they could consider a trade. And so let's talk about a couple of options. First, Lamar Jackson. Jackson would be a perfect fit for this offense. Play action, bootlegs, get him to the edge. You've got a tight end that you can use over the middle, a la Mark Andrews. It would be a real fit with what Arthur Smith wants to do. With the draft capital they have, there's a chance that they could make a move for Lamar Jackson. The other name to consider would really be Trey Lance. Are the 49ers really going to move on to Brock Purdy? If so, Trey Lance might be the cheaper option out of the 2, depending on what the Falcons thought about him in the pre-draft process. So the second route would really be free agency. Daniel Jones is a name that stands out for the scheme. He can execute on these concepts. He's not a Lamar Jackson, but he does have that mobility, and he also protected the ball this last season, which is very important to a coach like Arthur Smith. However, he's not a franchise quarterback. He could just keep you in a state of limbo. The other option would be Geno Smith. Not quite as mobile as Daniel Jones, but he was pretty good this year from a scrambling perspective. Not going to use him on the design run concepts, but a very accurate passer that would definitely elevate their ability on pure drop back plays. So the final option here would be the NFL draft. If you look at the Falcons and where they sit at pick 8, they are in striking distance if they want to trade up and get into the mix for Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, or Will Levis. The other way they could think about this in the draft is to look at Anthony Richardson, who per the Draft Network has a 2nd-round grade. The Falcons do have a high 2nd-round pick. If they felt they needed to, they could even try to trade back into the late 1st round to target him. But it's really about the profile. A very high ceiling here, 6'4", 235, 4.40. He has the big arm. He keeps his eyes down the field. So all those raw traits you're looking for are there. The problem is the floor could be really low. 53% completion rate. That was 122 out of 128 qualifying FBS quarterbacks. So a boom bust pick, probably don't want to make that selection at pick 8, but something to definitely think about in the early second round or maybe trading back into the late first. So let's talk about the second thing that the Falcons need to do, and they have got to unleash Kyle Pitts, and they've got to retain tackle Caleb McGarry. So despite a down year, the first player we've got to talk about here is Kyle Pitts. Now, I know he was frustrating for you as a fantasy manager. You're probably burned, never going back there again. But before you make that decision, you've got to understand this is still an elite talent profile. 27% targets per route run. That's as good as it gets, folks. Not only can Pitts demand targets, he can do it in a way that is very beneficial to a team. His 13.7 average depth of target was the second best for a tight end. The average in the NFL for tight ends is 7.3. So you have a guy that can generate looks. He can do it down the field. He can stretch out the defense, and he's good after the catch. So there were two primary factors that really stood in the way, besides injury, for Pitts last season. Number one, only 59% of his targets were catchable. The NFL average for tight ends is 80%. And so that led to a 50% catch rate, and that really depressed his fantasy value. The second thing is really Arthur Smith pulling Kyle Pitts off the field. He only hit the 80% route participation in 4 of 9 healthy games. The Falcons have got to find a way to keep this guy on the field. So now let's talk about Caleb McGarry. A huge component to the Falcons' success last season was the number 1 graded PFF run blocking unit. They really outperformed expectations, and McGarry, their 2019 first rounder, was a really big part of that. He was the number 2 graded run blocker by PFF behind only Trent Williams. The team has the money, the cap space. There's no reason to not get it done. Our final recommendation for the Falcons, they have got to add players that can pressure the passer and cover on the back end of the defense. The Falcons were atrocious from a pass rush perspective last season. They ranked 32 in adjusted sack rate. They were 31st in third down conversions allowed, and Grady Jarrett is really their only quality front 7 player, and he's going to be 30 years old next season. And while not being able to pressure the passer was a huge concern, it was amplified by the Falcons' inability to cover. They ranked 26 out of 32 teams per PFF coverage grades, and they only had one secondary player finish in the top 50 grades, and that was Isaiah Oliver, their slot cornerback. If you look at current mock drafts, you've got 3 of the top pass rushers going in the top 7 picks, so there's a chance that one of them does make it to the Falcons. We've got Will Anderson, Tyree Wilson, or Miles Murphy. If for some reason one of those guys are not there, we've got multiple options at cornerback and safety that the Falcons can pivot to. So the next thing to think about is free agency, because we know that the Falcons have the money. The good news is this is a pretty strong class from a cornerback and safety standpoint. You've got James Bradbury, a top 10 corner. Sean Murphy-Bunting will be available. He's a top 25 corner. And then Emmanuel Mosley from the 49ers is also inside the top 30. And at safety, you've got Juwan Thornhill from the Chiefs. He ranks number 17 in PFF coverage grade. And Taylor Rapp, who comes in at number 23. So between what they can do in the draft, hopefully with an edge player, adding a couple of pieces in the secondary, we could see this Falcons defensive unit take a big step forward in 2023. So that will put a wrap on it for the Atlanta Falcons, a team with a lot of optimism. They've got the resources to make a big splash heading into 2023. So those are the things that we would do, but now you can jump in the comments and let us know your thoughts.